É isso aí, sem mais delongas, PHP em 2018, PHP Day Curitiba. Gente, é um sonho ter o Rasmus aqui. E só no final não saiam voando, vamos pelo menos tirar uma foto. Acho que, seria alguma coisa legal, assim, pro seu currículo. Você tem uma foto com o Rasmus, de todo mundo, assim, e tal, ele segurando o banner, então não sai correndo depois, tá bom? Então, without further ado, we'd like to thank you, Rasmus, for coming. And we have absolutely no words of how thankful we are, and we appreciate your efforts for coming. We didn't contact you. You contact us. Dude, I would never ever say, oh, Rasmus is gonna contact me, right? But he did, so, and thank you so much. And shake it up, man, it's Brazil, huh?
Oi. Oi, tudo bem? Eu não falo bem português, então I'll have to switch to English. I will try to speak slowly. My talks are always online at talks.php.net. You can find these slides there. I'm at Rasmus on Twitter. I'm originally from Greenland, way up there, northern Greenland, a small island off the coast of Greenland even, called Disco Island. Yeah, Disco, D-I-S-C-O. Born in the 60s on Disco Island in the middle of Disco Bay. That is as far from Brazil as you can possibly get, I think. The weather, everything about it is as different as it could be. That's me, playing with technology even when I was a baby. That's my parents and me sitting on the dog sled in Greenland. Really, really far from Brazil, this environment. This was our house, middle of nowhere. The closest town was down the hill, down there. There was literally nothing around. It was because it was an ionosphere station. The ionosphere is the lower levels of the atmosphere that is used for shortwave radio propagation. If you're going to bounce radio signals all the way around the Earth, you can't shoot them straight through the Earth. It bounces along the atmosphere, the ground, the atmosphere, ground, the atmosphere. And in order to optimize the signal, you tune the signal, tune the frequency a little bit, depending on the nature of the ionosphere. So this was an ionosphere station that my father ran, where he measured the ionosphere, and then he radioed back to the Danish Navy to tell them every day which frequency was best today. And that station needed to be somewhere completely radio silent, with nothing around, in order to get the best signal. It's a bit like when you put a big telescope on top of a mountain in a very dark place. You don't put a telescope in a city. There's too much pollution, light pollution. Same thing with an ionosphere station. You can't put it near anything. You have to put it as remote as possible. And this is about as remote as you can get. There are no roads to go up there. There is no airport. In the wintertime, you can get there only by helicopter. You fly into a spot down about here, and then you take a helicopter. In the summertime, you could take a boat and sail up the coast. So yeah, very, very remote place. This is downtown. Kekartassuaq is the name of the city. Very pretty in the summertime with the icebergs. One thing I always find fun when I come to Brazil, I always meet people who have never seen snow. And to me, that is so strange. Because I grew up with nothing but snow. There was snow everywhere. I didn't see a lawn, like a grass, green lawn, until I was 4 years old. And my parents told me I was afraid. I wouldn't step on it because I didn't know what it was. It was this weird green thing. It's like very strange. All right, so this was my first computer in the 1980s. It's a Timex Sinclair, 1K of memory. That box on the back is a 16K expansion module. I was very happy when I got that, because now I had 17K of memory. Wow. Then that VIC-20, a modem, my first modem. I could actually connect to BBSs and get online. And this was the web for me in the 80s. This is Z modem, which was a download protocol. The older folks in the audience will know what that is. There's a whole generation in the audience that have no idea what Z modem was and what this thing is. Even that's also very strange to me. It makes me feel quite old. In the 1990s, this was when I first came to Brazil in 1991. This was the web. This was Gopher. It was the closest thing we had to the web in 1990, 1991. Mostly used in universities. When you read a paper, at the bottom, you had the references. With Gopher, you would read the paper, then you could click on one of the references to jump to another paper. That was really the only place Gopher was used, was in academic environments. And there was no graphics, no pictures of any kind. It was all text. The entire world changed in 1993 when this came out. The first graphical web browser called Mosaic. I was working for a Brazilian company in Silicon Valley at that point, and I told them, look, we have to stop everything we're doing and go all out for the web. They didn't quite agree. They didn't think it was a good idea. And for those of you who are a little older in the audience, the company I was working for was called Nutec from Porto Alegre. And you probably know Nutec as a big ISP, a big internet company. I tried to convince them to do that in 1993. They weren't ready, so I quit. And a couple of years later, they said, oh yeah, let's do this. And they became a very big internet company, and they were sold a couple of times. This is the kind of code I was writing in 1993. This is a CGI bin written in C, and this was a terrible way of solving the web problem. The HTML was embedded. It was just horrible. Anytime you had to make a tiny change to the HTML, you have to recompile the C program, redeploy it to the server. Not a good way to do things. Most of the world started using something called CGI PM, which is a Perl module for writing CGI scripts. So now that same page, with just a little form asking for your name and age, would look like this. I still didn't like this. I didn't want to program my HTML. I wanted the HTML to look like HTML. I wanted it to be easy to separate the logic from the presentation, which people sometimes find funny because they think PHP is all about smashing it together in one. That was never the intent. The intent was to separate it like this. So I wanted my HTML to look something more like that. And I just wanted some magical presentation layer tags. In this case, I have an if and an end if. So a little bit of presentation level logic, and then tags to call into my business logic written in C or C++. And my whole concept of PHP was a C API for the web. with a very simple templating system on top. Nobody thought that was a good idea. Everybody just wanted the templating part. They didn't want to write any code in C. And I tried so hard for so many years to convince people, no, you need to use a strictly typed, compiled language for your heavy-duty business logic. This little templating system that I have, that's just for your display. Don't put your business logic in your template. It makes no sense. But again, everybody disagreed with me. Everybody put their business logic into my templating system. And they kept asking for more and more features for the templating system because they weren't writing templates. They were writing their business logic in it. And this was partially because the web was growing so fast in the mid-90s. There just weren't enough C developers around to meet that need. So it was a lot of non-programmers that had learned HTML but wanted to put more smarts and more logic into their HTML that migrated towards PHP. And that group of people would never write C. So my whole idea for PHP was wrong. Nobody accepted my way of doing it. So I had to change. I had to kind of follow along and figure out how do we solve the web problem, given that people don't want to write C code. Part of it was to make the templating language better, which I did. It wasn't great. It was never supposed to be a language. It was supposed to be a templating system. But in order to solve the whole problem, you needed the full ecosystem. And like I said, LAMP was not an accident. So LAMP stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, originally. Making sure those four things talk to each other really well was what I spent most of my time on. I didn't spend very much time on language design, which many of you will recognize. I did spend a lot of time on the ecosystem itself, making sure that PHP fit into Apache well via mod PHP, making sure that PHP could talk really well to databases. The original database I used called Mini SQL, and it didn't have cursors or any way to limit the number of rows that came back on a query. So if you're doing a search page and you just want to show the first 10 results, and there were 1,000 results, you would have to wait until all 1,000 came across the wire from your database server, and then you would just show the first 10, which made no sense to me. So I added the limit clause to Mini SQL to be able to say, select star limit 10. About a year and a half, 2 years later, MySQL came along, and they saw PHP and Mini SQL doing really well in the web space, and they said, we want you to support MySQL as well. And we have made it really easy for you because we have completely cloned the Mini SQL API, so you can just do a search and replace in your editor in order to support MySQL. Okay, that's cool. And I tried it, that worked, but I said, but look, I have all these sites out there are now using this limit clause, and MySQL doesn't have a limit clause. If you want to be compatible with the existing PHP applications, you need to add limit. And they asked me, what the hell is limit? That's not an SQL thing. It's not in the standard. It's like, I didn't know there was a standard. Apparently there is an ANSI SQL standard. I know that now. I didn't know that then. But they said, okay, whatever. If you say so, we'll add limit. And that's why today we have limit in MySQL and in Postgres and in many other databases. It was because it came out of this whole negotiation with MySQL. And I'm kind of glad that it came because it's a hell of a lot easier to use limit than like Oracle cursors or all the other ways of limiting a result set. But that little story was just to illustrate that I spend a lot of time outside of PHP or what you think of as PHP. To me, PHP is kind of like the whole solution. It's not just the language and the syntax. It's all the extensions, the documentation, the integration with Apache, and even the integration at the operating system level in certain cases. I also spent lots of time thinking about ISPs and virtual hosts and making sure that a virtual host could safely provide PHP to as many users as possible, simply by adding more shared virtual hosts to a single server. There are limits, like memory limits and time limits and stuff, that I added specifically so ISPs could somewhat safely allow random users on the same Apache instance, which made it really cheap for an ISP to provide PHP services to their customers. This is where Perl got it completely wrong with mod Perl. A mod Perl script can hook into any of the stages of the Apache request structure. So you can hook in and you can change the path lookup, for example. And so it means that if you're an ISP and you gave people mod Perl access, that Apache instance couldn't be shared with any other customer because mod Perl was simply too powerful. With PHP, I only hooked it into the content generation hook, which meant it was safe to share. So decisions like that were quite strategic, and that's where other projects really fell down because they didn't think about how this stuff, they programmed all the cool things they could think of without thinking about the impact and the sort of the strategic direction of what they were programming. And I think that's what PHP got right along the way. I also thought a lot about scaling down, making it very, very, very easy to get started with PHP. Like hello world in PHP. It's the simplest hello world possible, right? You open a text file, you type hello world, and you save it. That is a completely valid PHP program. You don't need tags or echo or anything like that. Hello world in a text file is a valid PHP program. And it actually generates the same set of opcodes as if you do open PHP echo hello world. It's exactly the same thing. And the fact that it's so easy to get started and to do simple things, like if you take an HTML page and you want to add the date somewhere in the middle of the page, probably everyone in this room can do that in PHP, right? You edit the HTML, you stick a PHP tag in there, echo date, anywhere you want. And then you reload the page, and hey, you have the date. For the Java developers in here, think about how you would do that in Java. How would you take an existing HTML page and put a date somewhere in the middle? It is not something you can do in 5 minutes. You probably need an entire day to think about how the hell am I going to do this? Right? No, because realistically, what would you do? Would you read in the whole HTML file first? Then parse it maybe to figure out where in the structure are you? And then once you've done an XML parse of this thing, then you edit that XML tree and put the date node in the right place? And then you somehow export XML to HTML? There's many, many things you would need. And you know how many stack traces of errors you will get before you got it right? And that's the thing with Java and many other languages. The first thing you try, you always get an error. And with Java, with a huge stack trace, it basically says, you're an idiot, you're an idiot, you're an idiot. And when your first exposure to the tool is the tool calling you an idiot, it doesn't feel very good. It's not empowering, it's not motivating. But when the first thing you try with PHP just works, it's like, hey, that was easy. What else can this thing do? Or even if it doesn't quite work, like if you put your timestamp in, you might have gotten the arguments wrong, so the date looks funny. You go, oh, weird. I wanted a 4-digit year, not a 2-digit year. So you go and you look up the date in the date function in the documentation, and you fix that. Usually the errors that you get from PHP or the sort of the wrong functionality, you can figure out what you did wrong. A Java stack trace, good luck figuring out how to fix that stack trace. And sorry for picking on Java. I know there are some Java folks in here. but it's a favorite thing of mine to pick on. All right, let's get to the present a little bit. So PHP 7.3 is coming out soon, within the next month or so. It's a pretty minor release. There aren't any groundbreaking features in it. There's just some convenience things, like the here doc. You can now put the closing tag anywhere on the line that you want, so you can make it look nicely indented in your code. And when it gets output, whatever white space is before the tag will be deleted from the body, right? So here there would be no space to the left of bar. If you wanted 2 spaces before bar, you'd go 2 spaces in from the closing tag, right? It just allows you to make it look a little bit nicer. Before PHP 7.3, this EOT would have to be out here in the left column, which kind of made things ugly. Also, there's been this weird tendency for people to put continues inside case statements, which I never really understood, but we've run across it quite a bit. And a continue in a switch is just like a break. You should have used a break if you just do continue. Many times when you read the code of one of these, they actually thought they were continuing an outside loop. So now PHP 7.3 will warn you and saying, no, this continue doesn't actually continue this loop since you're inside a switch. If you want to continue the loop, you can do continue to, or maybe this should have been a break, if that's not what you meant. Hopefully your code doesn't have any of these, because it's kind of crappy. You can now do references and list assignments. So here the $B is now a reference to. Both the long form and the short form version now supports references here. Minor feature, but you couldn't do this before. And now trailing commas in function calls are allowed. We added trailing commas everywhere in PHP 7.2, but we forgot function calls, so we're just patching that basically. There's also a new monotonic timer function called HRTime. A monotonic timer is a timer that always moves forward, as time should. Time should never stop. It should never go backwards. Right? It's not Doctor Who. It steps forward slowly. But the normal time on your system, it can go backwards. Think of daylight savings times, leap seconds. Think of your NTPD sometimes. If your system clock is drifting, NTPD sometimes speeds things up or slows things down to catch up to the correct time. And if you're just calling time or microtime in your code, that is affected by the system clock. HRTime ignores all that. It always moves forward. So if you're doing any timing sensitive code that relies on time always moving forward, you should be using HRTime. If you're using FPM, there's a new status function that'll give you the status of your server plus each running FPM child and tell you which request it's serving, what it's doing, how much memory it's using, things like that. You can make a pretty cool dashboard from this. There's also a new isCountable function. One of the things we changed in PHP 7.2 was we made the count function much more strict. People were calling count on everything, on objects, on static variables, all kinds of things. Like it just integer I equals 3, count I. Well, hell, well, there's 1, but why are you counting an integer like that? That's not what count is for. So in PHP 7.2, we added warnings saying, hey, you're calling count on something that's not countable. But we saw that resulted in people writing code like this. So they're always checking, is it an array or is it an instance of countable? If it is, then we can call count. That was a lot of boilerplate code to write. So we added isCountable that basically does that same thing. There's also array key first, array key last. We noticed that people were calling reset and end quite a bit to get the first and the last element, but that has a side effect of moving the cursor, and sometimes if it's not actually a real variable, you get a warning about references and stuff. So now this is a value only, get the first value, get the last value, with no side effects. There's also been a lot of work on DCE and SCCP, which probably doesn't say anything to you, but I'll explain that in a bit. Some other changes, the internal regular expression library has been upgraded to PCRE 2. A couple of other minor things. So things that might break when you try to upgrade. There's a very small chance that a really complicated regular expression could break. It's unlikely, but if you do see some weirdness with your regular expressions, read up a bit more on what's new and different in PCRE 2. None of my regular expressions were affected by this, and none of the ones at Etsy were affected. We have millions of lines of code. So I think it's really, really rare, but it is possible. If you're using ODBC router or birdstep, you're out of luck. But I doubt anybody in this room even know what these are. And various other things. Please see the upgrading guide that's online here if you're looking to upgrade. All right, performance-wise, PHP 7.3 actually has a nice little boost over 7.2, a little bit more over 7.1. Nowhere near the big jump from 5 to 7, obviously. That was a huge jump. But we are running a little bit faster now under 7.3. Latency is better as well, so we can see WordPress 4.9.8 on PHP 5.3 took about 130 milliseconds to render the front page, or to serve the front page, and we're down to 38 milliseconds now of latency. Even more important than single request performance to me is memory use, and the memory use has just dropped off a cliff. This is especially important if you're paying for instances like from AWS or GCP. You can now turn off half your instances if you're upgrading from 5 to 7. And no big changes in PHP 7.3 on the memory side of things. All right, DCE, escape analysis, and SCCP. This is really low-level compiler stuff, but I find it really fascinating. In simple terms, if you look at that first function there, a equals 1, return 0. That a equals 1 is meaningless. It doesn't do anything, right? A is a local variable. It's not being used. Why is it there, right? PHP 7.1 will happily compile that code and generate the opcodes that does the assignment and then returns 0. PHP 7.2 and 7.3 doesn't even add those opcodes. The optimizer looks at it and going, this is useless code, I'm not going to include it. And obviously, when you execute those two scripts, the second one is going to run faster because there are fewer commands to execute. And that's what gets cached in the opcache, in the opcode cache that's sitting in shared memory. So basically, it's as if a equals 1 didn't even exist as far as PHP is concerned because it's deleted. Go a little bit further. Here we're passing in 4 arguments, concatenating a bunch of things. Then we overwrite it, x equals 0, and return x. And here you can see that PHP 7.1 generates all those opcodes, all that stuff, does the assignment, and then returns x. In 7.2, there are the 4 lines. Those aren't actually executable opcodes. That just says where the arguments ended up. And it also doesn't even do the x. It doesn't create the x variable because there's no point. It knows x is always 0. So all this function does in PHP 7.2 and 7.3 is return 0. It just deletes the first 2 lines of the function, essentially. If we try to trick it, So here, this is valid PHP code. B equals A plus equals 3, right? Return A. Here the optimizer is smart enough to delete B, so the whole B thing is gone. There are some differences. PHP 7.2 only went so far for the optimization. There are a bunch of new optimizations in 7.3. So this one is a little bit more complicated, where 7.2 couldn't figure out how to optimize it, but 7.3 is able to. On the escape analysis side, escape analysis is analyzing the code to see if there are any possible side effects. So here, we instantiate A. A happens to be an empty class, doesn't have any destructors or constructors. And we set a property, and there's no setter or getter, and return X. In PHP 7.3, it says this function doesn't do anything. It just returns X. So it doesn't try to instantiate A. It doesn't try to set the property because it knows there's no point. This can't possibly escape because it looks up a level. It looks at A and sees this thing doesn't have anything that would let anything escape. However, if we added the structure to A, now there's a possibility of escape. Now when we instantiate the class and the class gets destructed when it falls out of scope, now it could escape. Now there can be a side effect. So in this case, PHP will not optimize that class instantiation away. It also looks into arrays and it does really fancy optimization. In this case, if you follow the logic and you look at what the optimizer has done, it removed everything and just says, this thing always returns 0, no matter what. It doesn't matter what's passed in. It deleted all that code and replaced it with return 0. Because whether X is true or false, since we're only returning the first element, and the first element is always 0, it knows. So the optimizer is really getting smart. It is basically executing your code and looking at it going, this thing always does this. We can just delete all the code and just do that. And then we can get a little bit ridiculous, right? So here's a whole bunch of code. But the optimizer says, I don't care, this thing always echoes 1 and returns 4. We'll just delete all the code because no matter what, it always does just those two things. What all this means is if your code under PHP 7.3 is twice as fast as it was under 7.1 or 7.2, your code is terrible. Because it means the optimizer has deleted half your code because it didn't do anything. So my suggestion is, if you find yourself in that position, don't post on Twitter. Don't say, my code, PHP 7.3 is so fast. It's amazingly fast. My code is dramatically faster, because people are going to look at you going, yeah, okay. All right, so another tool I've been working on is called Fan. It's doing static analysis on PHP code. You can install it very easily with Composer. Composer require fan. There's a configuration file that a very simple one is here. So if you have a standard Composer-like setup where you have a source directory for your source code and you have a vendor directory for all your Composer libraries, you can tell it your list of directories to analyze, which is just source, and an exclude directory that says exclude these from analysis, but include these files as in you want to load the classes, definitions, and the functions and everything, so that you can analyze the whole thing. But it won't report errors in other people's code. It'll only report errors in your code. You can also set a target PHP version. So you could set it to 7.3. You could say, I want to analyze this as if it's running under 7.3, and it'll give you errors that might be relevant to you when you're trying to upgrade. Then you run vendor bin fan, and it'll give you results. Some of the things it checks for are here. It checks for many, many other things. And just to give you an idea of how that works, if you have code that looks like this. So here we have a function that takes 3 arguments. These are things we can't do with native PHP 7 types. We don't have unions in PHP, right? So if the first argument can either be a string or an integer, but nothing else, you can put a PHP doc type that says this is a string or an int, this first parameter. The second one in PHP, you can tell it it's an array, but you can't tell it it's an array of only integers. With fan, you can. You can say this is an integer array. And even beyond that, you can say it's a shaped array. So this third argument is a shaped array. And a shaped array means that we're specifying explicitly that the array must have a key named mode and another key named max. If it doesn't have mode and max elements, it's not a valid argument. Even though it might be an array, if it doesn't have those 2 keys, it's not valid. So here, these first 3 function calls, these are all valid. String, int, and here I just mixed up the order. It doesn't matter what the order of the keys are, right? So these 3 are all valid. This 4th call is not valid because the first argument is an array. And this is the type of error you would expect to see from fan. Fan says, sorry, you passed in an array, but this function takes an int or a string. Or in this case, my shaped array is incomplete. The string is okay, this integer array is okay, but this array only has a max key. There's no mode. And it was defined that it has to have a key named mode in the array to be a valid argument. So you can get really, really detailed on what your functions and methods require as arguments. Same thing for return arguments. Anywhere you have arguments, you can do that. You can also write plugins for fan. There's a whole bunch of demo plugins that comes with it. One of them is $. If you don't like the $, feature in PHP, you can say, well, in our company, we're not going to use $. And you can enable this plugin, and fan will then complain if anyone tries to check in code that has $. Stuff in it. I like $. I wrote $. But yeah, there's many other things. There's like a regex checker. There's a printf checker. So that actually checks that you have %d if you're providing an integer to a printf string, and that your regexes are syntactically valid. Because a lot of these things you normally wouldn't be able to see until runtime. And at runtime, unless you have a unit test that covers that code, and most people don't have 100% coverage with their unit testing. So things can slip through, and you only discover these things on your production site when a user actually hits the problem. This is where static analysis is really valuable, that you can catch these things before bad code hits production. There's also a daemon mode, which is cool, because you can run this thing in the background, and it keeps the analysis in memory, and it can really quickly tell you if you've added a new error. I have a little video just so I don't have to type. But basically, it's showing my config here. I have a bunch of plugins in my configuration file. Then I edit some code. I start my daemon, first of all. Then I can edit some code, and I can mess it up a little bit. So as soon as I try to save the file, I see the error. In this case, I'm saying this thing returns an integer, but a constructor can't have a return value, right? So it catches these errors, and right in Vim, it tells me. It's a little bit like PHP Storm does, but you can now have that in any editor. It's a very simple little script to plug this into any editor you want. So if you're a diehard Vim or Emacs user, you can have these types of static analysis checks as well. And here you can see the printf check, right? And the regex checker as well in action. Anyway, so that's fan. I highly recommend, if you have a big project at your company that you're in PHP, that you set up a fan config file for it and run fan regularly. At Etsy, we do this. This is part of our continuous integration. Your code has to pass fan before it hits production. I have many developers swearing at fan sometimes, because fan can be a little bit strict, but it all depends on how strict you make it in the configuration file. Every now and then, I make fan at Etsy more strict. I add new checks. I fix the existing code, but people get surprised sometimes that they're now not allowed to do something. But that's the luxury you have if you have a controlled environment where you can tell your developers what to do and what not to do. With fan, you can really enforce that. You can put whatever crazy rules you want, and you can have fan enforce that for you. All right, last thing. Quickly, PHP Spy is a cool new profiler. It's a very low overhead profiler. You can find it on GitHub. What it does is it pokes a running PHP program and sees what it's doing at any one time. You can set the frequency of the checks. It's in nanoseconds, so that's a lot of nanoseconds. I want it every 200 milliseconds in this case, just to show what it does. So this program sleeps for 1 second. And every 200 milliseconds, I check it. So that would be 5 checks in 1 second, right? So that's why you see 5 back traces there, or stack traces. That shows, well, we're main sleep. So that's where we are in the program. We were in the main loop, and then we called sleep. And we see that 5 times. That's a super simplistic way, but that shows you exactly how it works. You can run it on existing stuff. Here I pointed it at a FPM process that was currently serving WordPress, and it gives me these stack traces into WordPress, showing me where it's currently executing. And it looks okay, it looks cool, but it's kind of hard to read. So it also comes with these scripts that let you create a flame graph. And when you run that, you can get something like this. So this is a flame graph of me running fan, and you can then zoom in and see exactly what's happening in various parts and how much time it's spending on the different phases of a fan analysis. So here's a post-order analyze thing. At Etsy, kind of surprisingly to me, we use PHP Spy a lot for debugging. We have Gearman jobs that run for quite a long time. We have some cron jobs written in PHP that run for a long time. Sometimes these things run for a lot longer than we expect, or they just won't stop. And it's really handy to attach PHP Spy to it and get a flame graph of seeing where is it stuck. Sometimes it's stuck in an infinite loop. It's jumping between like 3 different places, and it's stuck in a circle. And the flame graph shows it exactly, because in that flame graph we see here, 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 then it's back here, 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 and it's just stuck there. And it's really, really cool debugging tool, especially because you don't have to do anything special. You don't even need debugging symbols in your binary. You can run it on any existing PHP process. So, really cool new tool, written by a colleague of mine at Etsy. All right, that was a little bit technical, I know. For some of you, it was way too technical. For others in here, they're going, oh, cool new toys, and they can't wait to get home and try them. I can see that. So, my talk, my slides are online here. Hopefully we have some time for questions. Yes? Good. I love the question and answer part. There's already one right here.
Só para quem quiser fazer perguntas e não tiver muita facilidade com o inglês, eu posso tentar ajudar daí, tá? Então não se sintam acanhados se essa for a questão.
Nice, awesome talk. Congrats.
Thank you.
I have one question to you about how do you see the near future related to the PHP? What do you think about the last functionalities that was added to the language, like the types, the
type
properties.
Type properties, right.
And what are the 2 or 3 main features that you would like to see in PHP in the future?
Okay, so PHP 7.4, the main feature is going to be type properties. Basically, if you have a class property, you can now say this should only be an integer. This is a bit of a performance hit if you're writing to properties a lot. The way I like to explain it, if you have a loop counter, right, while this I++, that would be a really bad idea, because it has to do a type check every time you write to this property. And it would be insane to have a class property be a loop counter to begin with, right? But it basically illustrates, if you have code that writes to properties a lot, there will be a performance hit with type properties. There's no way around it. We're hoping to find some other optimizations to offset the hit a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very commonly asked feature, but it also will affect performance slightly, depending on how much you write to properties. If you mostly read, you're fine. If you change the properties a lot, yeah, your code is going to slow down a little bit in PHP 7.4. Going a little bit further in the future, for features that are not going to be in 7.4 but might be in PHP 8, things I'm looking forward to, the JIT, first of all. I think the JIT is very interesting. There are also folks working on pre-compiling parts of PHP, meaning that you can pre-compile some PHP code and hopefully run it via the JIT as well, and have that always enabled, basically, almost like it's an extension written in PHP. So you can write PHP code and make it native to PHP. So it doesn't need to be included or anything from your other code. You can simply, in your INI file, you can add some PHP extensions. You could have a string class, for example, that has all your string functions named exactly the way you want, with underscores or without underscores, in whatever order you want, without a performance hit. And I think PHP level extensions with no performance penalty, I think would be a really, really cool feature to have. The other one we've been playing with is Fibers. Fibers is a lightweight multitasking mechanism. So you could potentially have multiple threads, if you will, or multiple fibers of PHP execution going concurrently. It's a little difficult getting that right. Well, it's not a little, it's a lot difficult getting that right. But that was basically, to answer your question, those are kind of things that I would like to see done really, really well. But we're 2 to 3 years out probably, especially for Fibers. That one's going to take some work. All right, I saw more questions.
Mais perguntas?
Way at the back, of course.
Okay,
Run.
Yes.
And then the next one should be right at the front.
Why do you like the dollar stuff? To me, it's just nuts.
Come on, man. There are many times when it's really cool to be able to dynamically create variables. For example, from database column names, right? In order to map database column names directly to variables, you don't know the schema beforehand. You only know it once you query the database and grab the schema, and then you can map variables directly to those column names, for example. Now, if you ever use more than $2, then I agree with you. That's just nuts. If you ever see $3 or $4 in a row, yeah, that's crazy. I agree. But $2, I don't agree that it's nuts. I think there are use cases if you use it correctly. Not everyone does. I know that. Other questions?
Mais perguntas?
Over there.
Vamos lá.
When we do some variables like integers or float, we need to sometimes format the output, or like a date, have a date time format and that things. And in the future of PHP is the great type hintings for all variables if you want and use these things automatically, or you want.
Let me stop you there. I don't think we're ever going to add types for normal variables.
Okay.
That would just be too slow.
No, okay. No, I don't know
Okay.
what the type of the core of
Right.
the PHP. Because of that, I asked this question. But
Right.
if you say is it slowly,
Yeah.
I think you were right.
Unless we dramatically change the engine, so maybe by PHP 10,
Okay.
the engine will be so dramatically different that that's possible. But the current way it's structured, if we have to do a type check on every single assignment of every variable, like even loop counters and stuff like that, no, it's not that we couldn't do it. Of course we can do it, but most apps would probably lose 40 to 50% performance, and I don't think anyone is willing to take that hit, especially since our static analyzers are getting better. And in the static analysis, you can add types to anything you want, and you get errors statically. And then why check the error every single time this thing is hit? Just check it once before you push it to your production servers. That's one of the things people get wrong about HHVM, for example. They thought HHVM had strict types all over the place. No, they just integrated a static analysis tool much closer to the engine itself. It didn't check types at all at runtime. It only checked it at compile time. And if it could detect an error there, then yes, it would say this is the wrong type. But it didn't actually do runtime checks. We don't have a static analysis engine in PHP itself, but we have external ones now, and that's probably the better place to do that check.
Another one here.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is regarding that optimization that has been added to PHP 7.2 and 7.3. So my question is, doesn't that make the PHP compiler slower? Because now you've had to add it to make it smarter. So
Yeah, so it does slow down compilation a little bit. That doesn't tend to be an issue because of the opcode cache. So if we take a 10% hit on compilation, but we get a 1% speed up on execution, great. Because your code is going to get hit a hell of a lot more than how many times you change it, right? Because it's only, the very first hit is slightly slower, right? But then the next 3 million hits of that script are going to be faster, right? So I'm willing to take a tiny little hit there. If you're not, if you're running CLI without the file cache and you don't want that hit, you can turn off the optimizer, right? There's an optimization level set there. And if your op cache is off completely, it doesn't do it, right? So there are very few instances where a slightly slower compiler actually matters. And actually the PHP 7 compiler is slower than the PHP 5 compiler because it does so much more. Nobody has ever noticed that because it doesn't matter, right?
Ok, the last one, última pergunta, quem tem?
Hi, Artemis.
Hello.
So I was at your talk last year on Fortaleza, and you showed us DCE and SCCP, and it was awesome.
Right.
And back then, you said that the next challenge was to detect some side effects that could happen.
Right.
And now on 7.3, we saw that you already made a lot of changes.
Yeah.
Do you guys plan to add more features? Like on the example you showed, we instantiate the A class, but the destruct doesn't do anything.
Exactly, right. So it only looks up one level right now. So it sees, is there a destructor? It doesn't also go into the destructor. Obviously, that's the next step, to go up more than one level, to basically go up and then in. So yes, I expect that we will continue this trend of looking further back in the stack. It starts to get complicated though, because you start to, the code involved is already pretty complicated. So it's a little bit dangerous going too deep. It's safer. Right now it's pretty safe because if there's any chance of escape, we don't optimize, right? Our error condition, or our error state is like we fail on the side of, if there's any doubt, don't optimize. We don't want to screw up the code, right? The deeper we go, the harder it will be to make sure that we don't screw something up. But yes, definitely. The goal is to go higher on that. Okay, folks, I'm tired. I've been flying for 2 days, it seems. So thank you very much for your time.
Uou! Que evento maneiro! Foi legal ou não foi? Sensacional! Só um minutinho, não saia, a gente vai bater uma fotinha para registrar, acho que esse momento para a gente ter mais edições, né? É sensacional. O que eu pediria por gentileza? Vamos todo mundo que está nessas laterais aqui, tanto dessa lateral quanto da outra, pular para a fileira do meio. E talvez você que está aí no fundo, só um pouquinho, último gás, último esforço, pular um pouquinho mais para frente. Por quê? A gente vai pegar o raso, colocar ele aqui, junto com o banner e tal, e a gente vai bater uma foto com todo mundo, todos os attendees, os participantes. E é isso aí, a gente quer ter esse registro, acho que é muito fundamental, né? Acho que isso é fundamental, a gente ter essa foto. Acho que quem não quer ter uma foto com Rasmus, né? Então, vai pro meio, vamos lá, vamos encher isso aí, vamos entupir. Pode, fica ali no cantinho. Os speakers, quem for speaker também pode pular aqui para frente, né? Os speakers. Cadê a música no fundo aí? Para esse pessoal ficar animado.